to begin this meeting by acknowledging that the land on which we gathered is situated within the traditional and treaty territories of the Mississaugas. More specifically, the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, First Nation signatories of the Gunshot Treaty of 1788, and the Williams Treaties of 1923. This land is and will continue to be home to the Indigenous peoples. Let us acknowledge the mistakes and traumas of the past through authenticity and support truth and reconciliation. Let us engage and celebrate Indigenous communities by being leaders of action in acknowledging the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations towards truth and reconciliation. Let us keep these principles close as we continue towards truth and reconciliation, and we move forward with kindness and respect as a community. Thank you. So, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interests? Any member of council not being, there being none, I should say. I need a mover for the adoption of minutes 3.1, the regular meeting of February 3rd, 2025. I think I saw Regional Councillor Crawford moving it, and second, Councillor Bauer. Could we have a vote on that, please? Okay. We don't have anyone. Okay, that passes. Item number 4, public meeting. There are no one speaking today, I was told. So, yeah, it's not a public meeting. Or it is a public meeting. It's not a public meeting. Right, none. It says right there. Moving on to 5 presentations reports. It's 5.1, and it's the Zoning Our Future Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw Review. Project update and phase 1 approvals, accessory dwelling units. Mr. McCullough, I see you there as per Director Romanowski. You're the Supervisor of Planning and Policy and Research. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, members of the committee. My name is Sean McCullough. I'm the Supervisor of Planning Policy and Research here at the Town of Ajax. And today I'm here to provide an update on the Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw review, as well as the approval of a zoning bylaw amendment and official plan amendment related to accessory dwelling units. So really quick update on the project. And just to remind everyone, so this is a project that began in 2015. And in 2024, we hit a major milestone where we released a series of technical reports, a draft zoning bylaw, held a series of open house and pop-up events, and a series of stakeholder meetings. This culminated in the statutory public meeting on October 7th, 2024. So following the statutory public meeting, staff were requested to investigate a few items that I'll be discussing later today. Since last fall, there's been a lot of change in the planning world. This has included a new provincial planning statement, amendments to the area of employment definition in the Planning Act, as well as the downloading of regional planning responsibilities to the town, which began on January 1st, 2025. As a result of these changes, staff are evaluating the impacts on this project. So to advance the comprehensive zoning bylaw review, staff are recommending a phased approval approach. So phase 1, which we are hoping to consider today, would finalize amendments related to accessory dwelling units and complete one of the town's Housing Accelerator Fund initiatives. Phase 2 would propose to move amendments related to the Strong Neighborhoods, Transportation, Greenland System, and Pickering Village technical reports. And staff continue to meet with landowners and agencies to discuss their comments on some of these items. And today we're hoping to finalize some of the direction items the council requested that we report back on. And then finally, phase 3 proposes to approve amendments in the intensification areas and employment areas. And this is where we receive the most detailed comments and complications from the provincial planning changes have been experienced. So staff are prioritizing the other amendments while continuing to work and meet with landowners in these other areas. So first up, we will discuss additional dwelling units. So the town committed to permitting 4 dwelling units per property as part of the Housing Accelerator Fund and to reduce related parking rates. Staff presented a draft official plan amendment and draft zoning bylaw amendment at the October 7th statutory public meeting. Staff have worked to isolate the amendments related to accessory dwelling units from the larger comprehensive zoning bylaw review to create a standalone zoning bylaw amendment. This amendment has been reviewed against the Planning Act as well as Ontario Regulation 299-19, which was updated in November 2024 to apply additional standards. So the amendment would permit the 4 units per property, except within the Greenbelt Plan area, where only one additional dwelling unit would be permitted. Other amendments include new definitions for attached and detached accessory dwelling units, duplex, triplex, and fourplex, applying a parking rate of 1 space per unit and permitting tandem parking spaces in accordance with the regulation, reducing setbacks from below-grade entrance to an interior side lot line, which is one of the most common variances that we see here in the town, reducing the setback to an exterior side lot line to an accessory building located in a rear yard to make it easier to build ADUs, increasing the permitted height of accessory building where there is an ADU located above a garage, and increasing the maximum lot coverage in the CR, R1A, and R1B zones to 45% where there's an additional dwelling unit, and this aligns with the regulation. We've also included standards that relate to public safety. So one would require a minimum 1.2 meter walkway from the entrance of an ADU to a road or driveway, and another would prohibit ADUs on hazardous lands such as floodplains or erosion hazards, and this was a recommendation from the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. So today, staff recommend approval of Official Plan Amendment 83 and Zoning Bylaw Amendment Z225. Working with Public and Strategic Affairs, a promotional campaign is planned to begin at the end of the month once the amendments are approved. P&D staff have also worked to create example building permit drawings for both attached and detached accessory dwelling units that will be available on the town's website. Approval of the amendments and the promotion of the changes would help finalize Initiative 7 under the Housing Accelerator Fund initiative, which we're excited about. And it would really help deliver additional housing units to the town. So next up, I'm going to go over the definition of height. And this was something that Council directed staff to investigate a little bit further at the statutory public meeting last year. So the current definition measures height of a dwelling with a pitched roof from the established grade of the street to the midpoint between the peak and the eaves of the roof. So this can result in houses that have a height in excess of 11 meters, which is the maximum permitted height. Staff completed a scan of other municipal definitions and permitted heights. We reviewed the history of the height definition here in the town, and we examined various building permits that have been approved over the last number of years. The table on the left compares the town's current height definition and permissions of 11 meters. Now, I note that this table is a general overview of many other municipalities, as there are areas in other municipalities that can really vary, and this is just a general standard. So as you can see, Ajax currently has one of the highest permitted heights of the comparable municipalities. Of the municipalities scanned, some have similar definitions to Ajax, which measure to the midpoint. However, others have a definition that measures to the peak or the highest point of the pitched roof. The table on the right adjusts height such that everyone is generally measured equally, and this was achieved by adding 1.5 meters to the permitted heights, where a definition measures to the midpoint to account for an average situation. As you can see, under the current definition, Ajax continues to have one of the highest heights of the compared municipalities. Option 2 considers an amended definition where we measure to the peak of the pitched roof while maintaining our current maximum permitted height of 11 meters, and this really puts Ajax right in the middle. When we were reviewing various building permits, most new houses had a height at or below 11 meters, and this change would provide some modest controls on height permissions while continuing to allow infill development to continue. So staff are recommending that the definition be amended to measure to the peak of a pitched or sloped roof. Additionally, when we were reviewing the definition, in the draft zoning bylaw released in 2024, staff had also proposed to change the height definition to measure the established grade from the front of the dwelling instead of the street in front of the house. We're recommending that we maintain the current definition, which measures to the established grade of the street in front of the house. Following a review of the building permits, it was clear that this was the easiest way to measure grade, and the proposed definition could have resulted in really weird grading situations where people attempted to achieve higher heights. Finally, as a result of the recommended definition change, it's staff recommendation that exception 18 in the Pickering Beach neighborhood be amended to change the maximum height from 9.14 meters to 11 meters. This is a result that the amendment could have inadvertently reduced the maximum permitted height in the neighborhood, and permitting a maximum height of 11 meters is generally reflective of the building permits that we've observed in the neighborhood, as well as minor variance applications that have been approved. Next up, short-term rentals. So staff were requested to define short-term rentals, and council directed staff to list the use. Now, this was interpreted at the time to not permit the use in any zone. On January 20th of this year, council passed a new motion directing that planning permit short-term rentals in urban residential zones where appropriate. At the same time, corporate services were directed to work with short-term rental platforms to acquire data, establish conditions, and work with the short-term rental platforms on issues of nuisance and enforcement. The report has a definition, and it proposes to permit short-term rentals in all residential zones, the Pickering Village, uptown, and downtown zones where residential uses are permitted. There's also an amended definition of bed and breakfast establishment proposed in the report, and this use would continue to be permitted in all zones where it's currently permitted, which includes the rural area. Finally, staff were requested to investigate or to permit takeout restaurants as a home-based business and report back to council on proposed mitigation measures. Now, we note that the current zoning bylaw and some of the changes that were proposed in the draft zoning bylaw would help to mitigate some of the impacts. So these include things like requiring that the use be secondary to a residential use, restricting the use to the inside of a dwelling or an accessory building, and permitting a maximum of 3 clients at any given time on the property. It's also proposed that a provision be added that the use cannot cause nuisance, be offensive, or obnoxious in any way with regard to public safety, noise, parking, odor, dust, and vibration. Upon further review, staff are also recommending 2 additional mitigation measures. So this would be to clarify that no licensed or unlicensed accessory outdoor patios would be permitted, and that a maximum of 1 home-based business be permitted per property. So in terms of next steps, today we're recommending that council endorse official plan amendment number 83 and zoning bylaw amendment Z225, and that the bylaws be sent to the March 24th council meeting for final approval. And as I mentioned, this would really achieve one of the town's housing accelerator funds and finish off that initiative. Working with Public and Strategic Affairs, the promotional campaign mentioned earlier will be launched to educate and encourage residents to move forward with the new permissions. And then recommendations related to the definition of height, short-term rentals, and home-based businesses would be incorporated into the Phase 2 zoning bylaw amendment approvals, which we hope to bring back later this year. Staff continue to meet with landowners and their consultants to move this project forward in a phased approach. And thank you. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McCullough, for your presentation and this vast topic. There's so many. Do we have any questions from members of council, starting with Regional Councillor Sterling Lee?
Thank you, Chair. So the way the OPA works is we kind of do this in phases based on what I'm reading, right? So it's like the component with agricultural, it says is not being considered in this kind of amendment. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, through the chair to Councillor Lee, can you clarify the question?
Yeah, sorry, that was very, very poorly worded. So this amendment or this bylaw review is only dealing with the short-term rentals and the businesses within homes, correct?
So through the chair to Councillor Lee, so the amendments that are before you today are only dealing with accessory dwelling units and standards that relate to that. The items related to height, short-term rentals, and home-based businesses, we're only seeking direction from council today, and we'll incorporate that into a future amendment that we will bring back to council at a later date.
So when it's all said and done, when will all the amendments be done? Because we're kind of going in like pieces, right?
Yeah, so it wasn't so through the chair to Councillor Lee, it wasn't our intention to bring it back in phases like this. This is just an approach that we're proposing today to try to keep things moving and finish off components as we can, where we're further ahead. The intention was to bring back the entire bylaw this year. So what we're hoping is that the amendment phase 1 would be approved, would be endorsed today and approved later this month. And then we're targeting either right before the summer recess or potentially September, depending on how everything goes for that phase 2 amendment. And then we would bring back phase 3 hopefully before the end of the year, which is the most complicated one.
Sure. If I may suggest, I do enjoy these digestible pieces. Like it makes it much more rather than the entire thing, which could be pages long. So thank you for the report. I agree with all the amendments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sorry. Next up, we have Regional Councillor Marilyn Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do also appreciate the fact that these are broken out into phases. I think it also helps the residents because it's a lot to digest is one big chunk of information. So it's great that it's being put out in 3 phases. I do have a question around the height one. I noticed that a number of the municipalities have a lower range, higher range. Why is that? What's the advantage to it and why don't we?
So through the chair to Regional Councillor Crawford. So again, this was more, we have zones that have different standards. So it was a little bit complicated. If you think of like a city of Toronto example, they have all of the old boroughs and everything, right? And there was a time when they all had their own individual zoning bylaws. They had different standards in a lot of those zoning bylaws. So when we were picking out rates, it's just kind of looking at, okay, what was the lowest, what's the highest? It's not an intentional thing. It's just kind of where some of their bylaws fall in place and the way they've come about over history. So it was just kind of picking out those standards and identifying them to try to get both ends, but some of them have many different height provisions that span all over the place.
So is that because perhaps the other municipalities haven't done a comprehensive review on their bylaws, so that isn't been updated?
In many cases, that's the case. I know Toronto did, but I don't think it's fully in effect at the time. This
Okay,
time.
that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Chair. So through the chair, we had a conversation last week, and we're just going to have it publicly now. I like to double check and triple check things, and want the residents to know. So just for clarification purpose, country residential, short-term rentals, meaning nothing above Taunton Road will be allowed to have a short-term rental moving forward, correct? Except if it's grandfathered in, with the exception.
That's correct. So through the chair to Councillor Henry. So the way it's proposed right now, in north of Taunton and east of Audley Road, the zones are generally permanent countryside or country residential. At this time, we're not proposing to permit short-term rentals in those zones. But you are correct. If there are existing legal non-conforming short-term rentals that exist in that area, they would continue to be permitted to operate until a time that they're interrupted.
Which would mean they would have to prove that they were legal non-conforming prior to this.
That's correct.
And that would be fun. So next question would be with regards to the HAF fund, the money we're receiving from the federal government, and restricted parking. So I wanted to ask about understanding that, we're getting this money from the federal government. It's a huge amount of money. Loving that. Not loving that parking restrictions, we can't put them in place anymore, maximum minimums and whatnot. But there's nothing attached, like we have to prove something to the federal government to get this money, but there's nothing attached to all of this saying, here's some money for a parking study or here's, if folks are parking on the road, how that will affect things, or parking where they shouldn't be parking. Like there's nothing in place for that, correct?
So through the chair to Councillor Henry. So at this time, on-street parking is not permitted. I know that it's been discussed in the past that there's a parking study or parking strategy in the long-range forecast to plan to look at some of these things comprehensively. But at this time, I'm not sure when that's currently proposed in the budget.
Yeah, and through the chair to Councillor Henry, I think the transportation or parking master plans put into the budget in 2026. But we have to do the ITMP, the Integrated Transportation Master Plan, before we do that parking study, and that's going to be done this year.
Understood. I guess what I'm getting at is we're getting a lot of money from the federal government, and we have to meet certain criteria to get the money, but I feel like there's a little tiny piece missing in all this, whereas if we're creating less parking in some of these areas, how will that spill onto the street, even though there is no parking on the street? Got it, clearly. But folks don't always know that. And what does that look like for these neighborhoods we're creating with less parking? You get where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
What I would say through the chair is people should inform themselves of what their parking permissions are within the neighborhoods that they live in.
But we're creating new neighborhoods too, correct?
Most of our neighborhoods are already established. Most of development would happen within stable existing neighborhoods that already have these parking issues. And that would be something that we would explore through the parking master plan in 2026, subject to council approval through the
Okay.
budget.
And if I may, through the chair to Councillor Henry, one additional item. So reducing parking rates down to one space per additional dwelling unit, that's something that's being is stipulated in the regulation from the province. So that applies to the 3 units. We're not allowed to require more parking. And then when we start looking at how much parking is actually being reduced through this change, it's only one space is being reduced. So typically your first dwelling unit requires 2 spaces. And then after that, it changes to 1-to-1. So at the end of the day, it's really just one less parking space once you start getting all the units compared to what we currently require.
So how does that work when a person that owns a house creates this type of living environment and they're renting to folks? Is there a requirement that they have to tell them that they only get one space and that there is no parking on town streets? Is there any requirement for that?
So through the chair to Councillor Henry, we don't have a requirement. That's not something that we typically get involved in. It's up to them to have that through their rental agreement with the landowner and have all that information. We can only abide by the regulations that we have when we're applying zoning restrictions.
So when they're creating this and we're going in and we're checking their permits and doing all this, we're not giving them information to say to the owner of the property, by the way, did you know that there is no parking on town streets and you are responsible for letting your renters know this? We're not telling them that?
So through the chair to Councillor Henry, that's not something that we're able to tell them. Even if you think of situations like a condo building or a rental building, we can require a building permit to make sure that there's enough parking, but whether the owner of the rental building is collecting rent for that parking space, that's between them and the renter. So we are limited in what our controls can be in that time of building permit, but that becomes an agreement between them and their renters. In a lot of cases, people pay extra for a parking space, right? They're not obligated to provide them that parking space. They can charge extra if that's something that they're providing, and it would be something that a renter should understand before they're picking where they're going to be living, is whether or not they have access to a parking space.
I understand what you're saying and I understand the comparison. It's a little bit of a unfair comparison because when you're talking about a condo or an apartment, you're in a self-contained property, whereas what we're doing here is like new and a little bit different. And there's only so many parking spaces. And if, folks are saying, oh, don't worry, there's lots of street parking, that becomes problematic for us. And I was just wondering if there's a way through this process that we could implement something, but you're saying, no, we can't.
To my knowledge, especially through this process, there isn't. But to my knowledge, there's anything. But that's something maybe we can look at through the parking strategy, and maybe that can be an item that can be the consultant can provide recommendations on.
I would just like to limit the fallback on our town staff in the end. Like, we're giving a good thing here, we're allowing it, but potentially there could be some backup, and I'm trying to, how do we eliminate that, right? Because bylaw's kind of busy right now. We don't need to add to that, so thank you for that. That's all my questions.
Thank you. Counselor. And next we have Counselor Lisa Bauer.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. McCullough. Nice to see you. Thank you for the report. Really appreciate the phased-in approach. Like my colleague said, it just makes it easier for all of us to digest. So one positive comment, love the communications plan that you have suggested. I think that will go far and will hopefully reach many of our residents. I have questions about Phase 1 and Phase 2. So for the ADUs, I just want to confirm I understand what tandem parking means. And I think it's just parking one in front of the other?
That's correct.
Okay, so if the main residence has, let's say, a garage that they use for parking and a big driveway with 2 or 3 spots, so that means that they would actually have enough parking existing for three additional units, is that right?
I think you said 2 in the driveway?
Yeah, 2 in the driveway, 1 in the garage.
Yep.
Okay, so the creation of new parking spots, I guess, would be required if someone applies for these and then someone goes to inspect and sees that there's not enough space for parking?
Yeah, so through the chair to Councillor Bauer. So on the building permit, they would actually have to show where those legal size parking spaces are located. So they wouldn't be able to get a building permit if they had 3 legal size parking spaces, but they were applying for 4 units. But they couldn't show where that 4th space is. The building permit wouldn't be issued because they don't comply to zoning.
Okay, great, thank you. And just for curiosity, based on resident comments or stakeholders' comments, do you expect a lot of permit requests for these types of units?
So through the chair to Councillor Bauer. So we are, historically, additional dwelling units have been creeping up year after year. It's been quite an exponential growth in terms of our additional dwelling units. So we do anticipate good uptake in these units. We have noticed a slight lull in the past year, and I think that's just given market conditions, where the unit numbers have been down about, there was, I think, 10 less units or building permits issued in 2024 compared to 2023. So there's been a slight lull, but we do anticipate that these will contribute to our largest unit growth in the town in a while, I think.
Okay. And do you see most of those applications are to renovate the principal residence into more units, or are they to add units in the yards?
So through the chair, to Councillor Bauer, it's hard to say at this point. I think the ones in the rear yard are relatively new product,
Right.
and I think that's going to take some time for people to wrap their head around. For many, it will be the easiest thing to do, because even when we are talking about 4 units in an existing dwelling, it's not an easy thing to convert the dwelling and accommodate all of these units. It does take a lot of, it takes the right house, it takes a lot of things. So we won't see them sprout up everywhere. So in some instances, the detached additional dwelling unit probably will be the easiest. But historically, those basement apartments have been very well received and continue to come in.
Okay, thank you. A question about the height for exception 18, so the Pickering Village neighborhood, and changing that from 9.14 meters to 11. So by doing that, does that mean that that area will fall in line with the permissions for the rest of the town? There will no longer be any exception there?
Yeah, so through the chair to Councillor Bauer. So that's correct. It would fall in line with the rest of the neighborhood. But even the way we've seen a lot of the building permits, because again, currently it's to that midpoint.
Right.
So a lot of the building permits that we reviewed in that neighborhood were in between about 10.5 to 11. I found one that was 11.6 meters when you measure to the peak.
Okay.
Right. So this will bring it down a little bit, but it's kind of in line with what has been constructed in that neighborhood.
Okay.
So we don't foresee too many changes down there.
Okay. No, and I really like the change of that height definition to be the peak instead of mid-peak. Thank you for doing that. And then my last question is about the home-based business, also part of Phase 2, where you mentioned that no outdoor storage or displays of material will be permitted. So that doesn't mean, does that include like actual store or business signage out front, or that's permitted?
So through the chair to Councilor Bauer. So we have a different sign bylaw that regulates signage in these neighborhoods. And there are certain standards that apply to home-based businesses, so that signage is generally a lot smaller than you would see in other commercial areas. So those standards are much smaller, and they're covered under a different bylaw.
Okay, so this just talks about materials
That's right.
for running the business, can't be out in the yard or whatever.
That's correct. You
Okay.
can't store if you're selling, I don't know, I can't.
Lawnmowers?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you
Okay.
can't display them in your front yard or anything.
All right, okay. Okay, thank you very much. Those were my questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mayor Sean Collier.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. McCullough. I just want to, Councillor Bauer touched on my question a little bit regarding building heights. I just want to talk about the measuring at grade versus measuring from the actual foundation, I'll call it, because I'm not understanding that reasoning of why you would want to do that. If you have a front yard that drops away, that means the house is going to be much shorter. Or if you have a front yard that actually goes up in grade, the building could be quite a bit taller than 11 meters. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, so through the chair to Mayor Collier. So you're absolutely right, and that's why we had originally thought about adjusting the definition. But if you think about most new properties, generally they're required to slope the grading towards the street. So they would be slightly elevated in comparison to the street. So the situation where it might be slightly lower, there won't be a lot of those situations in town. But in this case, it could be anywhere from a couple of feet, but difference between the road and the start of the foundation. And we think that it's a much more appropriate situation in terms of kind of controlling that height and providing consistent height across the street. It's not to say that there won't be situations where the grading could negatively or affect what can be built. But in those situations, they would just have to apply for a minor variance. Those I would say are more of an exception.
Well, and you touched on exactly my point. Most lots grade away, meaning going down. So nearly every house will be less than the 11 meters. We're changing from mid-peak to peak, adding 1.5 meters, which is fine. That compensates for that mid-peak to peak. But none will be 11 meters, probably because all of the lots are graded to a lower level from the street. Is it problematic to have it from the foundation level? That way they are all measured the same. And as you said, they will be uniform on the street as far as the actual building size, irregardless of the grade.
So through the chair, so you can do that, but in all the building permits that we reviewed, they all came in at or below 11 meters, and that includes, it's currently measured to the established grade of the street. So we really didn't see any situations or any issues with the way that it's currently being processed. But the concern is that you may have situations where people become intentionally trying to elevate their properties, which can have other issues on grading around them, to try and get something of a higher dwelling.
Exactly, which is again why I think it should be from the foundation, not from the grade. Does that not make sense? I mean, that would take away any thought of somebody regrading a property to try and get a little bit more height on their residence.
So through the chair, it would do the opposite. If it's measuring from the foundation, you would have people potentially, because if they elevate the grade of the property, that's how they get extra height. So that's what it's kind of working around the system to get more height on their property, when if it's established grade of the street, it's more of a constant across the street.
Okay, I think we're talking about the same thing in different ways. When I say foundation, I'm meaning where it comes out of the ground. You know, so.
But yeah, through the chair, what I'm saying is, if
somebody's going to slope the earth up against the side of their house to try and get a bit more height.
We've seen some crazy things.
I guess what my concern is we already have a fairly, no disrespect intended, long sort of protracted planning process, and adding the requirement to now go through a committee of adjustment and pay the $900 fee or whatever it is. based on, you know, the grade of whatever the front of the house is, I think is just adding an extra step that we may not really need right now.
Through the chair to Mayor Collier, as I mentioned earlier, this is what we're currently doing. It's a business as usual approach, and we're not seeing any issues at this time.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that was my only question. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. McCullough.
Thank you, Mayor Collier. I have, is there any other questions from members of council? I have a brief question. Number one, you framed it as reducing the parking to one space. And to my chagrin and other members of council, usually it's even lower than that these days. We're hearing 0.8s and 0.7s maybe per unit. So is that true? Like having, like in 2025, having something come to us with actually one space per unit, is that not?
To you, Mr. Chair. So I think where we see those rates, they're in things like condominium developments or apartment developments where there's a shared parking area. And in that case, you're right. When you have a 0.7 space per unit, there will be some units that just don't get parking spaces. But in this case, it's one space per unit, and it would be constant at that level. So every unit would have at least one parking space, but as we mentioned earlier, it's kind of up to the landowners to figure out how those are distributed amongst their tenants.
Right. But I think as members of council, we speak for everyone, but we always look past when this is all approved, it's all done, it's all built, people move in, then everybody goes away. And then we're there with the resident as per Councillor Henry's questions about parking. Like it's classic, right? And then all of a sudden we have a problem. So that's really what the spirit of these questions are. Same thing with, I like the clause on one of your slides that said, cannot cause nuisance, be offensive or obnoxious. And, you know, the more meat we have on that kind of direction, you know, cannot have large parties like that. That's the classic where guys rent, guys, girls, or whatever, rent units and they have these massive parties where there's like 600 people show up. So I don't know, I just, you know, as a heads up, maybe just a general statement rather than a question, when we're putting this into place and it finally gets approved, it'd be nice to have more direction and insight for the owners, the people that are permitting, even the renters, like all along that process. Because at the end of the day, it helps the residents that are there now and staff resources. So that's not really a question. Okay, I think that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
But we have Regional Councillor Crawford who wants back in, and I say yes.
Thank you. Just really quickly, when you have an application for a house to be demoed and rebuilt, I'm assuming that a letter is sent out to the whole neighborhood to say what's happening?
No, so through
So then, okay, if that's the case then, so to say that we're not having any issues with the current bylaw is kind of like, well, after the fact you have the issue, but there's nothing before that, like nobody gets any warning.
So through the chair to Councillor
Because it's
Crawford.
private property, right?
Yeah,
Sorry, through the chair to Councillor Crawford, issues specifically with what?
No, the comment was made that we have no issues with our current bylaw and the height.
Oh, in the height.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
and
we're
that was
talking about
only in
height.
relation to the measurement of height when we're reviewing building permits. So it was only in relation to where that measurement's being taken, but I don't think that has any relevance in terms of to like demolition permits and things like that. We review building permits, and when I made that statement, there's no issues reviewing building permits, and that
Okay.
the established grade becoming the problem.
Sorry, I think I missed the context of that statement, that's all. So is the reason why we don't circulate any notification because it's private property and really the neighborhood has nothing to say about it?
So it's not my area of expertise. The building department generally deals with this, but it's just they deal with so many building permits in their department, and the building code doesn't require notification. The planning process is kind of the process where if someone's asking for a change or something, that you have that public process, whereas the building permit process doesn't have that kind of process.
Because I know with the accessory in the back of, like if you were to build an accessory unit in the back, I've seen the notices go out from Committee of Adjustment, like, that has to be circulated, right? Like,
yeah.
that's a change in the property, correct?
Yeah, so if you think of like a zoning bylaw, the zoning bylaw is a set of rules that as a community council has agreed to. And then you apply to, if someone wants to change those, they're applying to the Committee of Adjustment to make that change. So that's where there's a notification, there's a public process associated with that. The building permit process is a little bit different. It's if someone complies with the zoning bylaw, then there's no notification requirement. And then if they comply with the building code, then they've met their obligation in terms of they can move forward. If you really start introducing like public process, it really starts to delay that building permit process, which people often complain that it already takes too long to get a building permit.
Okay, I think I've only really noticed two situations. One was in our ward and one was in Ward 3 where it seemed to be quite close to the abutting neighbor that it seemed very intrusive to me. I realize that it's private property and I realize everyone's coughing now. But I just feel like I feel like that's a big change. I feel like that should be something at least the four neighbors around should be knowing what's happening. But anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Just through the chair to Councillor Crawford, I mean, I think there's some obligation on the property owners themselves to talk to their neighbors about, hey, I'm going to actually be tearing down my whole house. Maybe you should know that. So, I mean, we can't do everything for everybody all the time, but I think that would be just like good neighborly kind of, relations. I'm doing a renovation. I'm putting a second story on my house. I'm removing the whole thing to build a new house. I think that would be more on like somebody, just being real with their neighbor that this is what's going on. So,
And I would love that in a perfect world that happened all the time, but given my role, I know that doesn't happen all the time. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from members of council? They're seeing none. We have here that the report dated March 3rd, 2025, entitled Zoning Our Future Town of Ajax Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw Review, Project Update and Phase 1 Approvals, Accessory Dwelling Units be received for information. Can I get a mover on that, please? Move. Oh,
It's just like the height thing, were we supposed to be giving you direction?
just 1 second. Evidently, no. Please stand by.
So through to you, Mr. Chair, the direction items, they're in the recommendation in the report. So we would have, if it was endorsed, we'd have everything we need.
Okay, so let's move on. Moved by Councillor Bauer, moved by Regional Councillor Sterling Lee and seconded by Councillor Lisa Bauer. Please vote. Everybody vote. And that carries. Okay, thank you so much. Next, we move on to 5.2, which is the required steps for implementing a heritage conservation district in Neighborhood 1. I thought we were Neighborhood 1. No, we're Ward 1. Neighborhood 1, because it's the first. Mr. Sawchuk will speak to this. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here.
So good afternoon, everybody. So the item that I'll be speaking to is the report titled Required Steps for Implementing a Heritage Conservation District in Neighborhood 1. And as you'll remember, this was a request that was actually made by council motion at the October CAP meeting back on October 7th. So first, a little history about Neighborhood 1. Neighborhood 1 is a residential area in Ajax that's directly east of the downtown area. Its name reflects its status as the first neighborhood designed and constructed by Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation as part of their efforts to convert the former DIL lands into a self-sustaining industrial community. So this area is really characterized by winding streets wrapped around internal parks and modest 1.5-story homes that are situated on large, spacious lots. And when looking at its value as a community, that value is really as a well-preserved example of a post-World War II development that showcases the application of modern planning principles. So the request to consider a heritage conservation district in this area stems from residents' concerns about redevelopment. So what's been happening here is there's been a growing tendency for old homes to be demolished and replaced with new homes that don't entirely match the character of the area. So the issue is that the town can't prevent this process because generally speaking, these new homes meet the requirements as they're set out in zoning. So this area is zoned R1B, which allows for heights of 11 meters, and it allows for building footprints of up to 33% of the lot. And those standards are actually well in excess of the traditional development that happened in that area. So when we're looking at opportunities to control or to protect for neighborhood character, there's really two main tools that can be considered. The first would be zoning. And through zoning, you can restrict quantifiable measures, so things like height, lot coverage, setbacks, that sort of thing. But through zoning, you can't effectively protect for character because zoning has no bearing on things like building materials, architectural style, and a lot of the characteristics that truly do give a neighborhood its character. Beyond that, the provincial government is looking to repeal or override any municipal policies, zoning, or plans that prioritize the preservation of physical character in neighborhoods. So the province is actually telling us that zoning is not the tool to use to protect for neighborhood character. Now, in the end, if the goal of residents, as spoken to at the October meeting, is to protect the existing characteristics of Neighborhood 1, it really is an HCD that's the best tool for the job. So a little bit about HCDs as a planning tool. These are specialized tools that can be used to ensure the protection of multiple heritage properties within a single designation. And the only prerequisite for the implementation of an HCD is first, that the municipality has policies within its OP to allow for HCDs, which Ajax does. And secondly, that the area being considered satisfy the heritage value criteria in Ontario Regulation 906. And in this case, we believe it does. So HCDs can actually be as large or as small as desired. There are cases where HCDs span entire municipalities. On the other hand, you have some very small HCDs that are only a handful of properties. But one key consideration is that HCDs do not actually require the consent of the property owners within that area. So the way it all works is the HCD plan sets the policy direction for the management of development within that area, and then it's a heritage permit system that actually gives the town some opportunity to make comment and to approve on applications that are received for anything affecting the outside of properties within that HCD area. Now, when it comes to the process to implement an HCD, this is all regulated very clearly and prescribed through the Ontario Heritage Act. You can see with the steps laid out here that there are a number of opportunities for council consideration, where council can either press forward with the project or opt out entirely, which would essentially end the designation process. So where we stand today is at the very beginning of this process. Essentially, the initial request to consider the HCD came in through that October meeting. And right now, we're at the first council checkpoint. Council has the opportunity not to move forward with the project or to move forward. And if there was a decision to move forward, the first step would be preliminary consultation with the residents. And that would be to ensure that we have a clear understanding of what the residents' desires are. And that would help scope how the HCD would be implemented. Beyond that, we would then, with council's direction, move to undertaking an HCD study, which really sets the parameters for the HCD. Then you would move forward to the preparation of the HCD plan and the bylaw. And the final step would be the implementation of the plan through the registration of the HCD. Now, this is a very simplified process. There would also be a number of public consultation processes that happen as these steps move forward. At the same time, there would be opportunity for appeal of council's decision at a number of these steps. So the primary implication of an HCD is that it's going to have an effect on property owners within that area who wish to modify the exterior of the property. So all exterior property modifications, except those very simple modifications that are exempted through an HCD plan, would require the approval of the town through the heritage permit process. Now, it's also interesting to note that where there's a conflict between the provisions of an HCD plan and any other municipal bylaw, it's actually the provisions of the HCD plan that prevail. So for example, if there was a scenario where the HCD plan said you could only develop up to 2 stories, but the zoning bylaw said you could go up to 3 stories, it would be the 2-story limitation in that HCD plan that would actually prevail. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about what HCDs are and what they do. And some of that relates to their effect on property values and insurance rates. So every empirical study that's been done on the topic has demonstrated that areas or properties within HCDs actually hold their value better than areas outside of HCDs. So there is no clear information that says HCDs actually reduce property value. Now, on the other side with insurance rates, the Canadian Insurance Bureau is on the record as saying that designation should not have any impact on insurance rates. So at this stage, the staff have done some very preliminary work just to ensure that an HCD would be, a reasonable tool and an effective tool in this area. So we've done a little bit of groundwork in terms of looking at construction dates and building integrity, which is really a measure of how much properties have changed over time. But we are cognizant that, we didn't want to do too much work without the without the direction of council. So to conclude the presentation, the designation of an HCD for Neighborhood 1 would be an effective tool for preserving the area's heritage value and for managing future development that could otherwise negatively impact the character of the area. Now, if council wishes to further consider an HCD in Neighborhood 1, the process for designation is laid out clearly in the report. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Do we have any questions from members of council? Regional Councillor Dies, you have the floor.
Thank you. And I know, I realize this, we've gone through this before in Pickering Village, and we went through a full consultation process, which I think is important. As you just said, it's complicated in how we understand that the Heritage District can help manage what's happening with rebuilding in the neighborhood. And can you explain to that with how that works with respect to the percentage maybe of the property that you could build on and how it would help keep that feeling, that same sort of neighborhood feel in that area?
Sure. So through the chair to Regional Councillor Dies, the HCD plan would be the tool that would really prescribe what development could look like in an HCD area. So typically you see this related through things like limitations on height, potentially through lot coverage, that sort of thing. Typically with an HCD plan, it's not so much based on numbers like a zoning bylaw would be. It's more about being in relation to the general scale of the properties that are contributing the value to these areas. So we know in this example that you have largely 1.5-story homes. And the HCD plan would be something that would limit heights so that new homes wouldn't overwhelm what exists now. Now, that's not to say that new homes could only be 1.5 stories as the additional houses are. There would be an opportunity to say something like full second stories are allowed for, but maybe third stories that you would otherwise be able to fit into an 11-meter zoning height. That's something that would be restricted through the HCD plan. So I think the most important takeaway from the HCD is that the municipality is really in control of the parameters that they want to put into play. And that's the value of the consultation, especially in this case, given that the request came from residents of the area. We would want to ensure that we had a very clear understanding of what they were looking for in terms of what they thought should be protected and the opportunities to develop sort of beyond what was traditionally developed in the area to give people the rights that they want to see as a private property owner.
And and I agree, things change over time, and we're starting to see that redevelopment. So part of the issues that I've heard coming from are also the setbacks, say, how close they are to their neighbors, or how big the house is compared to what it was previously. So can that also be incorporated in the HDCS to control how much of the property is used for that expansion?
So through the chair, it can be, but again, not in the way that you would typically see through zoning. Through zoning, it would be very specific and very much quantified. With an HCD plan, there tends to be a lot of things like diagrams that would show, an average streetscape, and then show an image of, okay, perhaps you can move a little forward than where the street line is right now compared to neighbors. But it's generally not done in a quantified way. It's just more so to provide an idea of the type of development that would be approved by the town. So the HCD plan is really there to benefit the people that are affected by the designation. It's direction to them to let them know essentially what they can do. And then any application that would be made would then come through the town for approval. And we'd look to ensure that what was being proposed was actually supported by what's in the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm noticing in this report that there's a cost estimate of $40,000 to $60,000, correct? That's to hire a professional heritage consultant, is that correct?
Yeah, so through the chair to Councillor Henry, if this project were to proceed, one of the later steps would be the establishment of the HCD plan, which is that policy document to guide change. And typically those are done by consultants because they have the expertise and they've worked on these projects before and they're familiar with the types of diagrams that are necessary and that sort of thing. So that's what that cost relates to.
And up till now, first of all, let me say the report was very well done. Very educational and lovely to read. So let me start with that. Up till now, the staff time that's been put onto this project, it's been yourself only as staff?
So through the chair, largely myself, some involvement from other members of the team. We had a student member that did a lot of the walking around the neighborhood, taking photos and that sort of thing. And then like any project, obviously, there's going to be involvement from management level as well, overseeing reports and things like that. But largely, it's been my responsibility to this point.
And moving forward, if this is approved and we were to hire the consultant, there would also be staff involvement, correct?
Through the chair, absolutely. Yes. So just like any project where we bring in a consultant, there would be a project management responsibility that was sort of relegated to staff. And I would assume that I would be the one responsible for that project.
Okay. And the neighborhood that we're looking at here, this entire neighborhood, if we were to do any type of consultation, we're looking to go out, whether it be a mail out or however we're going to get these folks involved, because it's very crucial that people that live in this neighborhood have say at the beginning of this. This is like, it's a must. There's no way around that. You're changing what people can do to their property, how it's going to affect their lives. Every person in this little map here on page 49, in my opinion, needs to be consulted. How are you going to achieve that?
So through the chair, we would obviously start at the broadest level, and this is looking at an HCD for neighborhood 1. So we would draw the parameters exactly as you saw them on that first plan I presented. We would be consulting with everybody in that neighborhood. Now, I think it's fair to say, based on some of the preliminary groundwork we've already done, it's very unlikely that we would consider an HCD that would cover that whole area, because we'd really want to focus in on the area where the characteristics are best preserved that we're looking to ensure the continued protection of. So, but in terms of the consultation, absolutely, we would start at the broadest level and communicate with everybody that is situated within that area.
And how would that be achieved? What form of communication? Because like social media is not going to cut it, in my opinion. Is there going to be a letter sent to every resident? How will this be done?
So through the chair, I mean, that's something we haven't fully worked out at this stage, because we know that, as I said before, there are a number of checks and balances as we move through this process, and we just wanted to get through this stage first and ensure that council had an understanding of the process for designation. But when sort of thinking through how it would play out, my thought would be two major elements as part of the consultation. One being obviously like a public meeting where people have the opportunity to hear a little bit about the project and to ask questions and get answers. But then beyond that, also a survey, because I think that can be a very effective tool for asking very pointed questions and getting very clear responses from residents as to, number one, are they interested in this tool? And number two, if they are, what are the objectives that they would like to see implemented through the project?
I'm glad this isn't in my ward. If it was, I would be insisting that every person in this map was mailed out a letter for a meeting, for a consultation. Because this could go bad really quick.
And I
so
think-
I'm going to leave that.
Yeah, and I think through the chair, Councillor Henry, like, that's how we send stuff out in planning. People get a mail out in their mailbox based off of their address in our property information system. So we wouldn't deviate from that process if we were moving on to that next step. That's the process that we would do. They get a letter in their mailbox.
That's what I was looking
We
for.
would probably post on the IMO. We would probably use all our normal channels of communicating an open house or any process
And would that
as
start-
legislated under the Planning Act.
And would that start prior to all this, like before anything started? You were talking about, we as a council have to approve this, and then you will start that process. You wouldn't go and say, we're going to send this out, do a consultation with the community first, and then council decide if they want
We have no direction from council to do anything other than come back today and tell you about the steps that are involved in the process. So if it's council's decision to move to that next step, that'll have to be a decision that you make as a group.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Councillor Bauer.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Sawchuk. Nice to see you here. Thank you for the report. And I really want to say that I really appreciate the amount of work and effort that went into this report to explain the entire process from start to finish. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. So I just have one question. I think somewhere in the report, I didn't mark the page, you did mention that this idea had been presented to the Heritage Advisory Committee. And if I could ask you to speak to maybe what the thought or some of the comments came from that committee?
Sure. So through the chair to Councillor Bauer, obviously the town's Heritage Advisory Committee is a very important group of individuals when it comes to any decisions relating to heritage in the town and heritage protection. So the intention from day one was always to ensure that they were kept up to date on what was happening. So the only communication that we've really had with the Heritage Committee is bringing forward the fact that this report was requested back in October, and just keeping them advised to the fact that if council so chooses, we could move forward with an HCD process here, which would obviously require their involvement through many stages, everything like setting out the parameters of the HCD study, approving the HCD plan. Pretty much everywhere where you see that council checkpoint through that process, there's also an HCD checkpoint. So I think the committee is very interested by the project. Obviously, it's a heritage project, and they're on that committee for a reason. They've got a lot of enthusiasm about heritage conservation. So I think there's been a lot of interest, but at this point, it's been mainly information items, and they're just waiting to hear back as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I do have some comments regarding the public or preliminary consultation, but I believe my colleague is putting forth an amendment, so I'll just wait until then. Thank you for that. That's my question, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bauer. Next, Regional Councillor Marilyn Crawford.
Can you tell me, when my early 8 years as a local councillor, we went through Pickering Village, I had no idea what was going on. Really early years. Poor Christy Crust. She took a beating when this came to the village. Is this the same type of thing that we're asking for? Is there anything different in this as what we were doing, eventually what we tried to do in the village, and then it got pulled back a bit?
So through the chair to Regional Councillor Crawford, yes, this is the same tool. It's an HCD designation, but each HCD is going to be entirely different because, as I mentioned, these plans are really developed in order to protect the character that's looking to be preserved. So in Pickering Village, I think the intent was to maintain the existing buildings as they are without many modifications because, you know, these are largely 19th century, early 20th century buildings that have value because of their architectural design, and there's a lot of varied styles, and so it's really keeping what is there. Whereas Neighborhood 1's an entirely different beast. This is a group of hundreds of homes that were all designed within the same decade, generally to the same specifications.
But not necessarily historical in their actual structure.
Exactly.
Different than Pickering Village, where they are historical structures.
Exactly. I think that you could really boil it down to the Pickering Village HCD is about protecting buildings, whereas this HCD, as I imagine it, would be more about protecting neighborhood character, right? Streetscapes, even the street pattern. I know that's not likely to change regardless of an HCD, but that is what really gives this value. You look at the winding streets all oriented around parks. This is the first time that was ever done. Prior to this point, you were looking mainly at grid patterns like you see in downtown Toronto everywhere. That's how communities were planned. So the fact that this was at the very front edge of that new sort of modern planning design is what makes this area important.
So, and I don't disagree, it's a very valuable historical part of our town for sure. When the village was being considered, I believe, did we not, this goes back like 14 years now, so you have to refresh my memory, but did we not ask residents to, there was some residential involved in that, not just the, like, Old Kingston Road. Did we allow them to opt in or opt out at that point because there was quite an uproar, if I recall?
So through the chair, I mean, I can only speak on a limited basis to the process because I wasn't with the town at the time, but I am familiar with the process, and it was my understanding that similar to this process, they started very wide, looking not just at that commercial core of the village, but also that whole length of Kingston Road, as well as the north-south route through Church Street. And it was my understanding that through consultation, a number of concerns were raised by residents, and in the end, the scope of that HCD was scaled back to be the commercial core with some residential that's, you know, very closely oriented to that.
Right.
So,
that's,
and I
that's
think,
what I recall too.
Yeah, and I think that's typically the process that these projects take. Sort of start large and then work into something a little tighter for a final designation.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Regional Councillor Dyes. Do you have a question or?
I have an amendment.
Okay, so I was told that I should ask my question because I have a question before we go to that.
No problem.
Thank you so much. Just quickly, chronologically, so our residents are all living their lives. Just as per the report, can you just tell us briefly how this came to be here today for us to look, how did that happen? Like, was that?
Sure. So the process, as I mentioned before, largely came out of the October 7th CAP meeting. And this was a meeting where it was the public statutory meeting for the zoning bylaw. And through the zoning bylaw process, we had engaged with a number of residents on a number of topics. And one of the things that we had heard about was an interest from residents on how to protect for community character. So in particular, there was a group at Neighborhood 1, as I mentioned through the presentation, that were concerned about what redevelopment looked like. And through sort of informal correspondence on that project, I I've mentioned in HCD as a better tool than zoning for protecting character for the reasons I outlined in the presentation. So at that point, during that meeting, there was a presentation from some of the residents from Neighborhood 1, sort of both elaborating on their concerns, but also requesting that the town consider something like this.
Okay, so I should have said, can you please reiterate?
Yes.
Because, yeah, it's all been stated. Okay. Now, if there's no more questions, then we'll go to Regional Councillor Dies. Oh, so,
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chair.
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Request a mover and seconder for the recommendation that's currently on the agenda today, and then we can open it up to amendments.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So request a mover and seconder for the recommendation that's on today's
Got it.
agenda, and then
Okay.
we can open it up for amendments.
All right, so it says moved by Councillor Henry and seconded by Regional Councillor Lee that the report dated March 3rd, 2025, entitled "The Required Steps for Implementing a Heritage Conservation District in Neighborhood 1" be received for information. So we vote on that now?
No, so now we'll open it up for amendments.
Got it. So now, Regional Councillor Dies. Thank you.
So I've gone through Clerk's Department for amendment on that motion. Basically, that before moving forward with any kind of a heritage district, conservation district, that we go through a full public consultation process. And the reason I bring that up is because, yes, we've done this in the village, and total confusion at the beginning after we go out and do that public consultation helps people understand, you know, the pros and cons, and they make a decision. And at the end of the day, it was a very, very well done public consultation process, and it ended very, very well. And we recognized it's complicated, and that's why we only fulfilled half of it at the time, hoping down the road we could do the rest. And as you're seeing now on that South Church Street, you're seeing some of those old homes being purchased for high rises. So it didn't get that protection. But in Neighborhood 1, we need to have that consultation. This is the second time this has come up, and we recognize that it has some value because it's the first planned community after we put in the industrial area across the street after DIL was here. So it's important to a lot of people, and the redevelopment of homes in the area I know has caused a lot of concerns. So I think, as the motion says, that staff be directed to conduct a preliminary consultation with residents of Neighborhood 1 to determine their level of support or opposition towards the designation of a heritage conservation district, and that the results of the public consultation be provided to council by September. So this gives us the summer months to go through the consultation process, and particularly interests me that this neighborhood has been connected through the SNAP program, and I think that's going to help us as to how we can communicate with each other, because those communication processes have been in place through this whole SNAP program for the last couple of years. So I think that's going to be very beneficial as to how we can have those conversations. So maybe we can look into that as well.
Thank you, Regional Councillor Dies. Do you have a seconder on this?
I do.
Yeah,
Councilor
seconded
Lisa Bauer?
by, Councillor Lisa Bauer. And are there any questions? Did you want to say, or do you want to speak? Sorry, as a seconder, you have the floor. Well, let me turn you on.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Regional Councillor Dies, for bringing this amendment forward. If it hadn't been you, it would have been me. So, and I would just like to talk a little bit about the intention of the motion at the October 7th CAP. It's funny that we find ourselves here asking for this public consultation because, quite honestly, it was my expectation from that CAP meeting that consultation would have occurred as part of the direction. So, which is fine. You know, I wasn't asked for clarification, but I did rewatch that CAP meeting, and I just feel that I would like to mention these items where I said I'm expecting the conversation will be had and information will be shared so that council can make the best decision. I also said this motion gives the direction so that we can have this conversation and see what is appropriate for today. And I know that some of my colleagues also made comments about who would be invited to the consultation or included in the consultation. So I think this report is absolutely excellent and was definitely required. And for me, the missing step was that consultation. So I'm very happy to see that this amendment is coming forward. And I think it's definitely the right move because that is what I feel we told the residents would happen at the first time. So I would like to follow through with that. And so I ask for your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions on the amendment? We have Regional Councillor Marilyn Crawford.
Thank you. Thank you for the report and your indulgence with our questions. Can we do this without having to spend $40,000 on a consultant first? Can we do the public consultation? I would hate to have to spend money on something and then find out that it's not really the will of the neighborhood. So can we do that first?
So through the chair to Regional Councillor Crawford, yes, the preliminary consultation doesn't really have any costs associated with it beyond minor items, things like sending out mail to notify residents. So absolutely, as I showed with the process to designate an HCD, the preliminary consultation would be the first step, goes back to council for more consideration after that, and up to that point, there are no major costs.
I have great confidence in your knowledge of heritage that you can handle that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, second that. Regional Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to clarify. So based on this chart, we're going to go through this kind of conversation 4 different times. We have to hit yes 4 times in a row in order for this designation to be applied, correct?
So through the chair, yes, in terms of the way the process is recommended. There are opportunities to consolidate steps at times. Like the HCD study isn't a technical requirement, but the process that needs to happen to get the information required for the study needs to happen somewhere. So I mean, there might be opportunities to change that so it's only 3 council checkpoints, but generally that lays out all the requirements.
And from what I'm told, variations of this had happened before, but we had stopped it at various points. Is that correct?
So yeah, so through the chair, this had been considered back in sometime between 2006 and 2010. An HCD was considered. We essentially got to this step, going out and speaking with the residents to get a better understanding of what they were looking to see. And at that time, it was decided that zoning would be a better solution than an HCD. Now, the reason for that is it was a very different time we were living in terms of provincial regulations and what municipalities were allowed to do and not to do. So at that time, we really thought zoning would be a good solution, and we actually started acting towards implementing that zoning solution before Bill 23 happened and a number of other provincial changes, which essentially told us we couldn't use zoning as the solution. So that's how we're right back to here as looking at an HCD again.
As far as Councillor Bauer's point, we actually couldn't do preliminary consultation without the initial request to consider the designation according to this flow chart. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So anytime that we do consultation, we want council to have a very clear understanding of what we're going out and consulting on. And we felt that, the process there was providing council with this report so they would have a very clear and fulsome understanding of exactly that.
Okay. So right now we are on box 1, council decision yes. Now we passed that. Now we're on to preliminary consultation. That will lead to the next council decision from there.
That's the way it's laid out.
Great.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Very good. Any more questions on the amendment? Okay, so we will vote on that now. And that carries. Thank you. And any other questions on the main motion? So once again, moved by Councillor Henry, seconded by Councillor Lee, that the report dated March 3rd, 2025 as amended, entitled Requirement Steps for Implementing a Heritage Conservation District in Neighborhood 1 be received for information. If we could vote on that, please. Okay. And that carries. Next, we have the all-important move by Regional Councillor Crawford, seconded by Councillor Bauer, that the March 3rd, 2025 meeting of the Community Affairs and Planning Committee be adjourned. Any questions, comments? No? Please vote. Thank you so much.